Good day, everybody. I'm very pleased to be at this very important ITU conference on the issues we have with accessibility and the new challenges that we have to face in ensuring that everybody can make the transition to a fully digital economy and society. My name is Professor Anthony Clayton. I'm the chairman of the Broadcasting Commission of Jamaica. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the issues of digital exclusion as we see them, because they have changed very significantly over the last few years. Let's start by thinking about what the problem really is. Clearly, there are still significant differences in levels of access to communication technologies between different parts of the world, between different regions within countries. And the factors that tend to be good predictors of exclusion include whether people live in rural or urban areas, age and income. Now these factors tend to cluster so that the problems tend to be concentrated. Elderly people with limited education, low incomes in poor areas and developing economies are the group that is most likely to have least levels of access to modern ICTs. Now governments always have to think about what actions they should, if any, take about particular problems. Governments always have insufficient resources, so they have to make difficult choices as to what their priorities should be. So the key questions that we have to ask is how big a problem digital exclusion really is. Is it getting bigger or smaller? Do we need to do anything about it, or will it eventually disappear by itself? There are three issues that we have to address in a little bit more detail. There's levels of availability, there's the affordability of access, because having access to something is only the first step, you have to be able to afford it, and there's digital literacy, technological literacy. You have to know how to use the technology to use it to best effect. So let's look briefly at all three of these. Availability is a rapidly disappearing problem. If I could just share a couple of numbers with you. In 2016, it was less than 46% of total world population had internet access. 2 years later, that was up by about another 10%. That is a problem which is disappearing very rapidly, and it's disappearing due to rapidly falling costs and dissemination of advanced technologies, even into the poorest countries of the world. So this is a problem which is becoming less salient over time. Where there are still remaining problems, in fact, you quite often find that this is not a result of the lack of access to technology as such. It's actually unhelpful government policy, like, for example, allowing inefficient telecommunications monopolies to remain in place and to have closed markets and not open this up to challenge. And quite often that turns out to be the primary cause of low levels of digital access. But this is simply a change in government policy that's required. It's not an issue with access to technology per se. In Jamaica, when we took stock a couple of years ago, we found that there was an issue with levels of access to modern communications. We found that for historical reasons, we still had 49 cable operators, which is a very large number for a small country. Many of them were not profitable, offering very limited service, and were often not in compliance with regulatory rules. And these operated in a total of 243 zones, which is an extremely large number. And the zoning system was created largely for historical reasons, which are no longer relevant. And what we realized is that these two factors, which were really the result of earlier decisions made by the government, are actually now preventing the rollout of better service in Jamaica. We realized that what we needed was to encourage the sector to go through a process of rationalization so that we ended up with fewer, stronger, better capitalized, better resourced and operators with more capital reserves so that they could invest in technology and roll out better services. We took a number of steps in this regard. We moved from a one-size-fits-all fee system to a three-tier system. Now what we're going to be able to do is offer some of the marginal operators a time-limited period of zero fees. This is not free money. This is to give them allow them to invest in technology. It's also to make them more attractive partners in mergers and acquisitions, so that we end up with a smaller number of better capitalized operators. And we're reducing the number of zones to about 10% of the original total. This means that every zone that we have in Jamaica will now be economically viable for service, for largely geographical but also social reasons. So many of our existing zones are not attractive to operators. So we have a situation now where some zones are very poorly served, but there's nothing there that would attract a larger operator. By reducing the number of zones, we're going to make each zone an attractive economic proposition. This will also help us end up with a smaller number of larger, better resourced operators delivering much better service to the public. With regard to affordability, this issue too is becoming much less problematic over time, largely because what is called Moore's law still works. The cost of a given unit of processing power approximately halves every 18 to 36 months. That means that every time you upgrade or change out your equipment, your cell phone, your tablet, whatever, and you do so every year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, you're getting approximately double the processing power each time you change. It means that affordability is becoming less and less of a problem. It's also becoming less of a problem for another reason entirely, which is that global poverty is largely disappearing. In 1999, something like 20% of humanity was classed as poor. That was 1.7 billion people. By 2013, this is only 14 years later, that was down to just 11% of the population, 767 million people. And as of earlier this year, it's down to about 600 million. This is a problem which is disappearing really very quickly, largely as a result of the development of countries like China and India, but there's actually about 40 or 50 other countries in that group which are now developing very rapidly. Poverty within a lifetime is going to become largely a thing of the past. So if affordability is no longer an issue, that leaves us with the third factor, which is digital literacy. And this may come as a surprise to many people, turned out to be the single most effective impediment. When we think of technology, we do tend to think of the actual physical piece of hardware. That's only one element. Your physical equipment is always embedded in a context of knowledge. You have to know how to use it, maintain it, capitalize it, leverage it for actual business or personal, financial, whatever reasons. The situation that we have now is that we already have over 100% smartphone penetration, well, mobile phone penetration, but most of those now are smartphones. And there are practically zero young people in this country who are not fluent cell phone users. But if you look at the actual usage pattern, they're mainly using them for chatting, social media, and entertainment. There's not many people in this country who are using, for example, utilizing the fact that you can now do a full degree at MIT or other prestigious universities online, and most of that material is available for free. But they're not using it to improve themselves or for educational purposes. They're using it largely for social purposes. So we have a situation where using the internet to its full potential for education and new modes of work is something that hasn't yet really spread throughout the population. And as the OECD pointed out in a recent report, the gaps that define the learning digital divide are as important as the gaps in access to the technology itself. So what we realized is that it is actually really the third variable, the one that's had least attention, which is actually now the most problematic. This is the issue of low levels of digital literacy. All the previous attempts to bridge the digital divide have really focused on hardware, for example, extending provision of broadband. And we do have still got some issues in that regard in this country. We're about to make a transition to a fully digital television service, and we're looking at transition fixes, like, for example, making affordable set-top boxes available to people who still use the old analog televisions, and that's still probably about 45% of the consumers. But it's not really a hardware issue any longer. It's really about lack of digital literacy. That's the most effective impediment to the transition to a digital economy. All citizens need to know not just how to switch on the phone, but actually how to access and leverage internet-based resources. The government has to do a lot more in this regard. The government can actually help to facilitate this change by providing a lot more services, reliable services, via user-friendly sites. This is still, by and large, not the case in this country, so the government has to do more and do better in this regard. The private sector have done very little so far in terms of business-to-consumer commerce, but the problems are the lack of security. Now, those concerns are real. We have major challenges with cyber fraud and card skimmers and so forth in this country. And citizens report that they're very unlikely to migrate unless they feel that the environment is safe. But here it is, in fact, the finance companies and the banks who have to do more to ensure that electronic transactions are secure if we want to make this transition to a fully digital economy. And the Broadcasting Commission is doing a great deal of work now in this area. We've developed a number of media literacy programs and digital awareness programs. In fact, we recently won 2 International Muse Creative Awards for our digital literacy advertisements. And these are designed to be very accessible and to be seen by the people who the particular demographic that we actually need to reach. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that gives you some idea of how we see the challenges which have evolved over the last couple of years, where we think the issue now is, and what we're currently doing about it. I wish you a very successful conference. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.